Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for a massive historical investigation. We're diving into a question that's honestly pretty wild to think about. Why do seemingly permanent ancient superpowers, societies that literally dominated the globe, ultimately just fall apart?
Right? Why did the world's most powerful empires suddenly collapse? It's a question that's haunted historians and scientists for centuries. I mean, think about it. Massive, supposedly invincible civilizations like Rome or the incredibly advanced Indus Valley, how do they just mysteriously fracture or fade away? Usually, when we picture the fall of an empire, our minds immediately jump straight to the dramatic stuff. Massive battles, invading armies smashing through city gates, or corrupt emperors watching their kingdoms burn. But what if the real culprits were actually things you couldn't even see?
So, we're kind of putting on our detective hats today. We're moving way past the old, simplistic, oh, the barbarians did it theory. Because honestly, barbarians and border conflicts, they were usually just the final push, the straw that broke the camel's back. Instead, we're going to decode the invisible, interlocking forces of ruin that actually rotted these civilizations from the inside out.
To help us solve this historical mystery, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at toxic air and lead poisoning. Second, climate change and megadroughts. Third, what experts call the trap of complexity. And finally, surviving the perfect storm. Okay, let's dive straight into this. Section 1. Toxic air and lead poisoning.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at some amazing forensic evidence that scientists recently pulled directly from Arctic ice cores. Look at that shocking number right there, 2.5 to 3. What does that mean? Well, at the exact same time the Romans were busy building those magnificent structures we all know, like the Colosseum, they were also extracting and smelting massive amounts of silver for their coins. And doing this released staggering, absolutely massive amounts of lead into the atmosphere. We're talking between 3,300 and 4,600 tons of it every single year during the Pax Romana, their legendary era of peace. Researchers studying those Arctic ice core layers found that this collusion spread all the way across Europe. It was so intense that scientists actually estimate ancient Roman children suffered a 2.5 to 3-point drop in IQ across the entire empire. Let that sink in. We're talking about a widespread, invisible cognitive decline that persisted for almost 200 years.
But we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions here. As health scientist Bruce Lanphier points out, it's never just one thing. Was this widespread lead exposure and cognitive decline a massive biological stressor on the population? Absolutely. But it wasn't the sole cause of Rome's fall. I mean, productivity during the Pax Romana was still incredibly high. So it's more like lead poisoning severely weakened the foundation, but it didn't just topple the building all by itself. For that, we have to look at the other forces at play.
Which brings us right to Pillar 2, Section 2, Climate Change and Megadroughts.
Let's shift our focus to the Indus Valley Civilization, over near the present-day India-Pakistan border. These folks had incredibly sophisticated, meticulously planned cities with urban water systems that would blow your mind. But take a look at this brutal timeline. 5,000 years ago, their rain-fed settlements were absolutely thriving. Life was great. But as rainfall began to gradually drop off, they were forced, around 4,500 years ago, to literally pack up and shift their populations closer to the Indus River just to survive. And then, well, the real hammer dropped. Around 3,531 years ago, a devastating 113-year megadrought began. Now, they didn't collapse overnight in some fiery apocalypse. No, instead, a relentless series of century-scale droughts slowly choked off their water supply. This forced even more shifting settlements and widespread deurbanization. They simply faded away under the crushing weight of climate pressure.
And here is the really crucial point for us to take away. This climate catalyst wasn't just unique to the Indus Valley. Not at all. Shifting weather actually crippled a bunch of other mighty empires too. For instance, a massive drought helped trigger the Late Bronze Age collapse around 1177 BCE. The Maya Empire, they were absolutely battered by hurricanes and localized droughts. You've got the Norse Greenland colony, which was literally starved out by expanding sea ice and dropping temperatures in the 14th century. And yep, even the mighty Roman Empire faced severe droughts and brutal cold weather in the 4th and 5th centuries that completely devastated their agricultural production.
Moving right along to Pillar 3, Section 3, the trap of complexity.
So, ask yourself, how do societies react when they're suddenly faced with poisoned air, failing crops, or hostile neighbors banging on the door? Well, they build systems. They build sprawling armies, massive bureaucracies, and complex infrastructure.
And this brings us to our heaviest intellectual lift of the explainer, systems theory and the sociological burdens of empire building. To really get this, we need to look at Joseph Tainter's theory. He argues that societies collapse because of diminishing marginal returns on complexity. Basically, when a society faces a new problem, it creates a highly complex solution, say a brand new government department, an expanded military frontier, or a fresh tax system. And at first, this works great. Problem solved. But eventually, the sheer cost of maintaining all these sprawling, tangled systems completely outpaces the actual benefits they provide. You end up pouring massive amounts of your energy and resources into the system just to keep it from falling apart. And the scary part is, it leaves you with absolutely zero reserves when a real crisis hits.
And this brilliantly illustrates the fatal cost of that kind of expansion. If you look at this, as the relative size of the Roman army grew to defend its massive, stretching borders, the relative cash flow began to severely lag behind. The Romans were expanding, sure, but the conquests were no longer profitable. They were basically forced to support this far-flung, highly inflexible military and administrative structure using nothing more than their yearly agricultural output. So what did they do? They had to debase their currency and absolutely crush their citizens with taxes. The complexity of the empire had quite literally become its greatest liability.
To make this a bit easier to digest, Tainter breaks these systemic vulnerabilities down into 3 really understandable models. First up, you have the dinosaur. This is a society that rapidly chews through its resources, but its ruling elite absolutely refuses to adapt or change course. Second, the runaway train. Think of an empire like Rome or the Assyrians here. A society that fundamentally depends on constant, completely unsustainable growth and conquest just to function. Once they run out of new lands to conquer, they fracture. And finally, the House of Cards. This is a society that has grown so massive with so many complex, interconnected social institutions that it becomes inherently unstable. You pull out just one card, and boom, the whole shebang comes crashing down.
All right, finally, Section 4, Surviving the Perfect Storm.
So, what does this all mean when we bring all the forensic, environmental, and historical evidence together? Well, we see how these seemingly invisible stressors start to compound on top of one another. They create what historian Eric Klein calls the perfect storm. It happens like this. Step 1. Environmental and biological stressors emerge. We're talking things like century-long megadroughts or widespread lead poisoning that slowly weaken the population. Step 2. To fight those stressors, the society activates that complexity trap we just talked about. They build massive militaries and bloated bureaucracies that completely drain their economy. And then, step 3, with the society totally exhausted, overtaxed, and possessing absolutely zero emergency reserves, a final push happens. Maybe it's an earthquake, a plague, or an invasion. But that final push triggers systemic societal collapse and massive deurbanization. The dominoes just fall.
Which really leaves us with a rather haunting thought to end on today. When we look around at our own modern, deeply interconnected industrial society, we have to ask ourselves a pretty tough question. As our own global complexity rapidly grows, are we actually solving our problems, or are we just increasing the cost of our eventual collapse? Understanding exactly how these invisible forces of ruin toppled ancient empires might just be the key to ensuring we don't repeat their fate. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the world around you.